Welcome. Tonight at the St. Croix Foundation Community Information Session, I'm glad to welcome you here. I would like to introduce Ms. Deanne James, the president of the St. Croix Foundation, as she will be giving our opening remarks.
We made a point to make sure that we had some students involved, so every opportunity is an opportunity for them to grow and to learn. Welcome, and thank you for coming out tonight on behalf of the Foundation's team and our community of nonprofit partners. I'm pleased that enough of you thought that this was an important issue to come out and participate in. Tonight is a community information session. It's about information sharing, and it's about opening lines of communication. The questions we've posed to key stakeholders are serious and focused questions about environmental health and safety, and about environmental regulations and monitoring. The Foundation is committed to setting a high standard for how high-stakes conversations are framed and hosted, and we invite all of our guests here tonight to likewise commit to building a culture of healthy civic engagement. Just to provide some context, 3 years ago, the St. Croix Foundation launched what has become one of our most important initiatives in our 29-year history, a civic collaborative, which we've named the Nonprofit Consortium. When we conceived the consortium, our goal was initially to nurture a culture of collaboration and trust among local nonprofits in order to create a sustainable civic sector. We have dedicated significant resources and effort to supporting our nonprofit partners and the people they serve, seeking to help them grow and to empower them to lead in 4 distinct civil service subsectors, including arts and culture, health and human services, youth and education, and the environment. In May of this year, we hosted what we hope to be the first sector forum focusing on our environmental nonprofits. It was an informative convening that explored the history of heavy industry on St. Croix and facilitated the early development of a cohesive vision for the future of this island and the territory on a whole. What also evolved from that forum unwittingly positioned the Foundation to become a repository of data and inquiries, which we have fielded with some regularity over the past several months. Some of the issues that were brought to our attention were actually quite serious and highlighted several things to us. First, that residents seemed to feel real reticence about taking their concerns and experiences to the relevant authorities for resolution. 2, that residents did not know what the relevant protocols were for addressing their concerns. And 3, that key stakeholders, i.e. regulators, refinery representatives, and legislators, were not doing an effective job at providing residents with important information to empower them and to allay concerns, rumors, or fears. While we waited for anyone, to do what we are doing tonight, our frustrations have grown as well. That is until 3 weeks ago when several residents walked into our office to inform us about an incident that took place at or around the refinery recently that we collectively believed demanded greater attention. Tonight's community information session was developed in demonstration of our commitment to civic leadership on difficult and important issues facing our community. We recognize that there are a multitude of issues, particularly around human health and economic development, which are equally important. But for tonight, for this conversation, the questions we have posed to our invited guests are relatively narrow. Invitations were extended to the Department of Planning and Natural Resources, the Department of Health, to VITEMA, to Limetree, to the Senate Committee on Economic Development, Regulations, and Agriculture, as well as the Senate Committee on Government Operations, Consumer Affairs, Energy, Environment, and Planning. That's actually one committee. Along with those invitations, we developed targeted questions that we felt adequately addressed the concerns which had been raised by community stakeholders, and the answers to which would provide important insight and greater awareness for residents. Our questions were submitted to invited guests with a request to 1, attend in person, 2, to identify a representative to attend in their stead, or 3, to provide written answers to our questions so that we could read them into the proverbial record. All invitations were followed up with reminders and calls. As of today, we received formal responses from 2 invitees. First, and those 2 people are sitting at the front of this room. First, upon setting the date for this event, we were directed to the Senate's legislative calendar and learned that there was a scheduled Senate hearing for Wednesday, November 6th, that's tomorrow, wherein Limetree will be providing updates to the Senate Committee on Government Operations, Consumer Affairs, Energy, Environment, and Planning in St. Thomas. We also received a call from a representative of the refinery notifying us that because of tomorrow's hearing, no one from the refinery would be in attendance tonight, as they were focused on preparing their testimony for tomorrow. We were also informed that Limetree is planning to host their own community meeting or town hall in several weeks. So, who did respond promptly to our invitations was the Director of VITEMA, Mr. Darrell Joshin, and Commissioner of DPNR, Mr. JP Oriole, both of whom have significant emergency management and regulatory roles, respectively, and as such, have the capacity to answer most of the questions we developed. So we will proceed as intended. We will try to run through our questions swiftly, then open up the floor to some structured Q&A to have everyone hopefully on the road around 7 o'clock. Tonight is really about our community, about empowering people in the Virgin Islands to nurture real courage and competency around civic engagement in order to build the community we all envision for ourselves and our families. That will ultimately demand first and foremost information, not innuendo or rumor, but real fact-based information which you all have the right to obtain. Today, St. Croix Foundation and our nonprofit partners are kicking off one conversation. The follow-up conversations are in your hands. We have created a website, engagevi.org, which is intended to be a very young iteration of what we hope it will become, not solely about this issue that we're discussing tonight, but about every issue that significantly impacts the health, welfare, environment, and future of this territory. Thank you so much for coming.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Frandel Gerard, Executive Director of CHAMP and a member of the environmental sector of the nonprofit Consortium. And I am co-moderating. I'm taking a step back so that she can step forward. And would you please introduce yourself?
Good evening. My name is Lilette Gruby. I'm a student here at the University of the Virgin Islands. And I hope that we have an informative night tonight. I would like for our panelists to introduce themselves, please.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jean-Pierre Oriole, JP for short, and I am the Commissioner for the Department of Planning and Natural Resources. Thank you for having me.
Good night. My name is Darrell Joshin, the Director for the Emergency Management Agency, known as VITEMA.
Thank you. So we're going to start right off with our question. Our first question, is DPNR capable of independently monitoring a chemical release episode from the refinery or landfill in a manner that will generate or provide data necessary to assess whether the release poses an unacceptable health threat to its residents?
So the department collaboratively monitors the facility between the DPNR and the US EPA. We do that by setting certain limits and standards for emissions through a number of permits, whether that be something called a Title V permit, whether that be something called a MARPOL permit, whether that be something called the refinery sector rule permit. So inside of each of these permits, there are certain standards and limits, and the department, along with the EPA, what we receive is the raw data from the refinery, because they have to have all of these mechanisms on their releases and report that raw data. And so the department then reviews all of that to see whether or not there were any exceedances that took place, And if there are any active exceedances, the refinery is then required to report any releases that are sustained at the refinery. In addition, it's important to note that a lot of the machinery is set up so that they have automatic switch off valves and such if it in fact is releasing at something that's exceeding what is allowable by the standard that's inputted into it. And so by reviewing these reports, by receiving the monthly, and these are rolling year round because there are a number of different permits, but there are several sets of eyes that are in fact monitoring and looking for whether it was a small release that was exceeding or a large release that causes a regulatory action that takes place.
Thank you. So what mechanisms are in place to acquire the technical support from the US EPA to monitor release episodes? And what are the response times involved in the event of an emergency or an exceeded emission, as you just discussed?
Sure. So there is a relationship between the department and the US EPA. They have a response branch based in New York. Their response time is typically within 24 hours to the Virgin Islands, between 24 and 36. They also have a satellite office in San Juan, which also can provide response. As an example, when we needed additional support this summer with the fire that was happening at the Anguilla landfill, they were able to come down and provide support to us by establishing portable air monitors around the facility and in the community to make sure we could judge and assess how far that particular matter may be flowing from the incident area. So we do have a response protocol. It's a formal request that goes in from the department to the chief of the response branch in New York, and they typically will send the personnel, whether it's out of Puerto Rico or New York, to the territory to assist us in that regard.
Just a quick follow-up, if you don't mind. So, as you receive the reports and you advise the EPA, in the event that there is a substantial emission that may cause harm, what's the turnaround in advising the community of what's going on?
So, in the event that there is a substantial release, then that's where Director Jashin comes in, and the Emergency Operation Command is stood up. And so the department, DPNR, is the lead technical agency on something called the Emergency Support Function 3, which is for airborne and aqueous releases. But once the incident is large enough, the Emergency Operations Center becomes the centralized position. All releases, communication to the community, those go out from the Emergency Operations Command, and those updates take place just like as if we were in the, for example, following a hurricane or something, where you have those periodic updates, whether it be by a press release, whether it be by a press conference, but anything, it goes through the Emergency Operations Command and is a coordinated event that keeps the public updated regularly.
Thank you. What procedures does an obvious chemical release from a major industry or facility such as Limetree or the landfill? How is it investigated, and how does DPNR bring closure in terms of reporting back to the community their finding from a risk communication perspective? So
again, that piggybacking on what I just said previously, depending on the nature of release and the size of the release, DPNR endeavors to check every single complaint that is brought to the department. If there is a release that is determined to be substantial, then that the Emergency Operations Center is going to be activated, and then even a week after we've officially closed that incident, there's still something called the after action report, in which all the agencies that were involved report to Director Jashin in terms of what are the things that took place, what are the things we need to improve on, all of that. But the findings and everything is then reported to the public as well, whether it be, again, through a press release, press conference. The two have both been used in the relatively short time that both Director Jashin and I have been there this year alone. If it is a minor incident, that is something that's usually handled in-house. And again, residents are kept apprised. A good example of that is on the island of St. John. A few weeks ago, we had a spill of about 50 gallons of fuel on a public roadway. The department was on scene. We worked with the establishment where they have the spill. We worked with the fire service and public works to have sand spread on there. When the cleanup was completed, a press release was issued to notify the residents on St. John that this was the situation. 50 gallons of fuel had spilled. Assessments were made in the surrounding area. We made sure that all of the sand that was used to contain the spill was cleaned up and that operations were now running normally. There was no need for any concern from that incident. So again, depending on the level of release, depending on the specific incident, it will be measured and it will be coordinated in the respective ways.
So our next question, and we're doing this by the ones that were for Commissioner Oriole, and then we'll move on. Our current understanding is that crude oil and products will be transferred to and from the refinery in piping that has been laid in the waters of the Virgin Islands. Are there any provisions in the ratified legislation that ensures a high standard and probability of detecting leaks in the piping? And when there is a leak of oil in the waters of the Virgin Islands, is the refinery required to report the release? Are there specific stipulated penalties or fines in the ratified legislation that would automatically be assessed in the event of a spill or leakage? That's a multi-part.
Sure. So in terms of, I'm not sure specifically in terms of the ratified legislation what is meant, but I can speak to the single point mooring itself. So last year is beginning in 2017 and then carrying over into 2018 is when the refinery had requested the single point mooring. So what the single point mooring allows for is the larger ships to be able to release and receive their liquid petroleum products under a pressurized system at a much quicker rate than they would be able to do so and accept larger vessels, because there's a berthing limitation to be able to pull in all the way to the piers of the facility. Those cables and pipelines are not one continuous line segment, but rather they are multi-segmented positions that all have shutoff valves. And so, again, the two things is, one, the refinery doesn't want to lose any product whatsoever. And so there are specific pressure limitations that are placed in there such that if that pressure drops, then that valve shuts off. And each of these line segments is, it's limited to a specific length and a specific volume. And so I can't remember the specific number off my head, but let's say it's a 24-inch valve or pipe with a 70-foot segment. And so that volume of area, if in fact there were a release or a breach, it would be limited to that specific volume, because the rest of the cable will in fact shut down if the pressure is interrupted at any part of that. And so it's specifically designed so that any cleanup that would be necessary is going to be on a very small area and manageable by the department. By the refinery. The refinery also, they modeled their currents, they modeled the release points, they modeled everything so that they can put in place their spill prevention and their cleanup plan in case. They also hosted the Caribbean Regional Response Team activities last year because they in fact were having the single point mooring out. And so this is a team of folks from DPNR, the U.S. Coast Guard, the U.S. EPA, NOAA, that are all, if in fact you have an incident, how would you respond? And so they've modeled all of these things. They've included contingencies for shutoffs, making sure that anything that would be released is in fact manageable. Now, any release is in fact enforceable by the department. We do still have our Clean Water, Clean Air Act, and if in fact it is for negligence, we can definitely pursue some sort of administrative order. If it's accidental, we also have that at our disposal as well. But I think that there is a number of things, not only the laws themselves, but the actual equipment is in place in order to ensure that any sort of release is minimized as quickly as possible, because they don't want to lose the commodity. They don't want to lose that commodity in a long period of time.
Director Jason. I'm saying that correctly, right?
It's Joshin.
Josh.
Just like Joshin around, Joshin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. So we know that a comprehensive hazard mitigation plan is currently being developed for the territory to include natural disasters like hurricanes and earthquakes. Are contingencies being developed for natural disasters that will potentially impact the refinery and lead to catastrophic failures? If not, why? And what emergency plans are in place to inform the community of how to respond in the event of a man-made disaster at the refinery?
Okay, I'll respond. Earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, those are disasters we know that will happen in the territory. How we respond to those based upon island, based upon events, there's nothing specific we've done yet working with like Limetree. We're starting a relationship with them. And going forward, we want to make sure we have a specific focus with them, and part of that is developing exercises and going forward with that. We have an exercise set up in the end of April coming up, April 28th, 29th, and 30th, which involves the U.S. Coast Guard. Very much involved with that. Limetree, Vitima, DPNR, and other agencies. That's a great way for us to get together and practice a response mechanism to an actual event scenario. Again, scenario. It's going to exercise what's called a unified command. So whether or not you have a plan or not, the unified command is going to be stood up and will respond accordingly. We're talking about a private entity. We're not talking about a public entity, government of Virgin Islands. Similar to what happened at in Anguilla landfill, that was a territorial government agency. We could go in there, coordinate with our unified command. All the government entities involved with doing that. EPA was involved after the fact to come through and do the analysis. Went very smooth, good coordination. Limetree, because it's private, we have to work within their purview also, which is very, very important. We've had conversations with them already. And part of the exercise coming in April is really to figure out how do we coordinate together from a territory perspective, from my team as a coordinating agency, with getting the right messages out, collectively one message overall what's happening, quickly responding back to that, how that's going to happen, working with response perspective, can we do it ourselves with Limetree? Does a liaison officer from the Emergency Management Agency need to be there, from DPNR need to be there to help give specific details for assessments and support? And ultimately, how do we quickly resolve the issue? The first attempt we want to do is save lives always. Save lives that individuals are involved in, their individual responders. Second thing is get the word out to the public as far as what's happening, impact upon the public. Third is to look at the environment itself. How do you keep the environment safe from actually going out further and causing more harm? And from the Coast Guard's perspective also, if they're involved, is going back to that source to figure out what the source is and responding back to that source to stop it from getting worse. And that's part of what April is going to be. Answer the question about how do we notify the public. A lot of times The word Facebook comes up quickly, and it's not really Vitima doing the Facebook. It's someone driving by the highway, snapping a picture and posting it out there, and we're realizing it. The other perspective is 911 calls come in most of the time. That's what's going to be the first response to what's happening. And that 911 will then determine who responds, and most likely it's going to be fire and EMS and police. And Vitima as a coordinating agency, if more responders get involved and becomes a more complex environment, we will come out with Vitima, and that's where we start shining with bringing other agencies together. In some cases, we will call the National Guard with their expertise, in particular a civil support team. They have the ability to do hazard mitigation. They have the ability to monitor. They were called out part of the landfill response mechanism. They were monitoring the environment to find out how bad was it. So very important. The other mechanism we have is what's called Alert VI, which is subscription based. If you go to our website at vitima.vi.gov, you can sign up for that on your phone, on your text, on your email. You can get it in English or you can get it in Spanish, and the information that comes out is very detailed. If you sign up for it today, you'll get lots of information involving earthquakes and tsunamis and hurricane alerts, sandbags being issued out for hurricane preparation. That's a good way to get done. Ultimately, I have this wonderful tool called IPAWS, IPAWS, Integrated Public Assistance Warning System, IPAWS. That gives me the ability to anybody who has a phone, no matter what subscriber you use, no matter you just flew in from Miami, you will get a message of 90 characters. And it'll tell you pretty much how serious it is, where it is, but we only have 90 characters per message to get that out. And that's one of the key ways we do that. October 17th, this last month, we had the great earthquake shakeout. Hope you're a part of that. We sent the message out at 9 o'clock in the morning, an earthquake. Exercise, exercise, exercise. Hit. So what did you do? So hopefully you responded to that. So that's the best mechanism with 911, Alert VI, and iPods get the message out and a warning to individuals.
Thank you. I see our Senate President is here. Senator Francis, do you want to come up and have a seat at the table? Thank you so much for joining us. Because we have some questions for our legislators who showed up. We appreciate your coming. So we've just shared some of all of the questions with the panelists, and ouch, it didn't break. It didn't break, right? Okay, good. Senator Francis, at the end there are the complete set of questions. So, with your indulgence, since the refinery is not here, but we know that these gentlemen are well versed in the information as regulators and legislator, we would like to present some of the questions that have been presented to Limetree. And if I switch to Hovenza, forgive me, Limetree, they're changing. There's one question we know only the refinery can answer. So for the record, we'll just read that question. Please provide an update on the status of the restart to include timeline for official restart and employment levels for local hires versus mainland hires at all levels, i.e. executive, supervisory, rank and file. And also, indicate if there are existing protocols in place relative to background checks and sex offender registers. They have not given us an answer to that yet. So now these questions we think can be fielded by the panel. The first one is, prior to the closure of Hovenza, there was a rash of release emissions that posed potential health threat to residents in surrounding neighborhoods, including students and teachers at schools in close proximity to St. Croix Industrial Complex. Commissioner Oriol, are there mechanisms in place to alert regulators that a release is actually occurring?
Yes, and every permit that is issued requires the facility to report a release that exceeds what their permit conditions are. if it's a continued, if it's not something that's corrected, and I don't know the specific time frame offhand, but they are required in order to report the release if it exceeds what the permit conditions are.
So if a release sets off and it goes for 3 minutes, is there an alarm system or a recording system that DPNR officials or VITEMA officials are automatically being updated on?
So
I mean, not the self-reporting thing, you know the self-reporting.
right, no. So we don't have automatic access to their system. We do have access to their reporting system, but it's not live, real time in that type of manner.
Are there any real-time public notification protocols? And is there any amount or level of release that would trigger the need to notify the public immediately?
So in the event of a notification for the public, the protocol would be that we would coordinate with Director Jashin on that release. So he would use iPause, he would use whatever is available, but we would get out there, notify the public, and implement whatever our emergency support function protocols might be. So that might be to cordon off or quarantine a specific area. It might be to place additional monitors downwind after looking at what the real-time currents are, air currents are. We do work with the National Weather Service on those patterns and such. So depending on the level of release and the type of release, we would activate what our emergency support function is.
Just expand a little bit on the iPOS system. You know, we test it monthly, so it's not a matter of it works or doesn't work. So we do test it, and the beauty behind it, it does go out to our radio stations. So they're not waiting for us to call them and, oh, by the way, here's the message. You know, that message we put out that will go to your telephone also goes down to the radio stations, also would be broadcast through some of the television stations locally. So that gives us multiple means by which we get the message submitted out. But the challenge is make sure we get the right message submitted out as timely as possible. We don't want to get misinformation. That's usually one of the challenges. You know, we'll say, hey, the territory understands what's going on. We're working on it. We'll get some more information out as soon as we can. But we realize it's sensitive information. We want to make sure it's right, and that's why we go back to the experts to make sure we understand what's happening. Similar with the wind directions, the wind speeds, the downwind hazard message, who's affected, not affected. We look at what happened with the landfill fire. Luckily, it was blowing offshore to the south, not a whole lot of down in Frederickstead was affected. If it had changed a little bit, then it would have been a big impact for us. So a lot of that monitoring is very, very critical to getting the message out properly.
So how, continuing this, and you know, we might be belaboring it, but you know, some of us are a little thick-headed. How soon after a release incident will a report be submitted to relevant regulatory agencies quantifying the emissions in terms of specific chemical containment and concentration profiles? Mind you, we did this thinking Limetree would be answered.
So I think it goes to the nature of that type of release, because one of the things that's unique about the refinery is the actual location and the fact that it's always being affected by the trade winds. And we're talking about releases that become gaseous and would be swept away with the air. I mean, it's not, there's not a radiation component to anything that we're looking at. There's not a, if it's an aqueous spill, that's a whole lot different, and that response would be different. But because we're talking about air and vapors, that's a little bit different. And so, but the idea is that the contaminants that we're monitoring for is measured in tons. And you know, 1 or 2 tons is not going to create an adverse effect immediately within, you know, a 3-minute release or something like that on folks. It's the sustained release, and so there's a certain tons per day that they cannot exceed. And if in fact now we found that this was taking place, that would be a trigger for us to alert the public, because we would also now be working with the Department of Health to see whether or not anybody's experiencing or saying that they're experiencing certain conditions and such, certain symptoms. And so, those are the things that we would be looking for. Again, a specific criteria when we're looking at 7 different types of compounds or types of releases. Anything could be different. I'm sorry, I thought my technical person would be here to help me out a little bit. I don't see Angie in the room, so. I'm right here. Thank you, Angie. So, Angie is by far much, much smarter than I am, and would probably be able to rattle off for all 7 or so. But what we are trying to do is so following up on a little bit, moving to the additional question D in terms of the equipment and the specific contaminants. We're looking at particulate matter at certain sizes that both affect human health as well as air quality. We're looking at volatile organic compounds, which involves mainly hydrocarbons. We're looking at sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide. These are the things that you would actually have a reaction to if in fact you were exposed to those. And so, but it would have to be a repeated and elongated exposure to which we would notify, because they are required to notify the department when they're exceeding whatever the limit is.
Just to add on to this, what you do once the word goes out as far as, symptoms, there's a discussion we've had, and after we had the Aguila land fire discussion, it was, if you're told to shelter in place, what does that mean? In some cases, it's best to stay indoors and shelter in place until the vapor goes by or the cloud goes by. So what does that mean? So part of what we want to do in our messaging, besides the iPods with 90 characters, to be able to provide more specific instructions. So we say shelter in place, it means you should close windows, close doors, turn the air conditioner off, put cloths down by your door. Those are sort of the guidances that we will develop as we go forward from a coordinating perspective to provide assistance to anybody who may be in that particular zone. If you're not in the zone, you should not have to worry about it unless the wind changes or something changes. So part of what the continuous monitoring and information putting out is make sure we keep you informed of how to respond.
Is Limetree Bay required to keep a log of resident complaints about chemical release episodes? And if so, are the complaint logs made available for public consumption?
I don't know from my team, I know.
Angie, is it something that we require?
Say it again?
Do we require them to keep a log of resident complaints?
It's not a requirement right now, but however, because of situations in the past, they have a hotline that was established in 2011 when they had an incident. You can use a hotline, it's logged. The information is usually given to the DPNR, and DPNR is where you get all public information. The only confidentiality they have is the patent for however they create their product. But everything else, if it comes to DPNR and we require a list of citizen complaints, you can come in and find out how many complaints, the areas of a complaint, the location from complaint.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So on September 24th, residents on St. Croix reported seeing large styrofoam buoys floating ashore on the south shore east of the refinery. For context, everybody knows the size of a Volkswagen Bug, right? Large. The buoys were about 5 feet long, 4 feet wide, weighed over 100 pounds each, and they broke into smaller pieces as they banged against the rocks. There were at least 50 of these along the shore. It took 5 days and numerous phone calls by concerned neighbors to get a serious cleanup response from the refinery, and small pieces of styrofoam, which are a hazard to birds and wildlife, remain on the beaches. This incident does not instill confidence in the ability of the refinery to respond quickly to an unexpected event. We ask that Limetree provide a brief overview of what transpired, as well as an update on the status of remediation. So since you're not Limetree, we want to know, one, was this reported? Two, what is the follow-up from our regulatory agencies? And it was a situation where a call was made to DPNR. The callers were instructed to call Limetree. So just so that you know that that's the way it transpired.
So yes, we did receive an incident report. They did report it. So the buoys are what is being used to hold the single point mooring, the pipeline that is being submerged. And unfortunately, while in the process of having those lines out and over, I think it was 1,000 or so feet of pipeline may have been out, we unfortunately had to then brace ourselves from the impact of Tropical Storm Karen. And so while Karen didn't really produce much in the area of rain, it did produce a number of high swells, which did impact that infrastructure that was out there. They did self-report that the buoys did, in fact, the lines did break, that some of them did, in fact, get in, that they were disturbed. And so I do know that they're working with our Fish and Wildlife Office in terms of the cleanup aspect of it. But it was one of those unfortunate incidents of whenever we choose to do something during hurricane season, sometimes your development or your project or something is interrupted by that. And that's what happened in that particular instance, is that they had the lines out. The contractors had to suspend operations because of the oncoming storm. And then the high swells did in fact impact the development.
What about part two of the question?
Well, thanks for Limetree. No, for Limetree.
So they're required to clean up. They are, in fact, like I mentioned before, they are working with our Fish and Wildlife Office on the cleanup efforts. I do know that we maintain a relationship with them regarding their wildlife. They do have, like, for example, a wildlife trailer that they keep to be able to address responses to any impacts to wildlife. There's also a company called Tri-State Rehabilitation, which is on contract to provide any oiled animal response. They can arrive within 24 to 36 hours as well in the territory. So the department, along with our federal partners, would play a role in triage immediately, but then the contractors would come in and provide response if necessary.
So, just a minute. It's not. No, we're not doing that. There are cards for questions. We really want to keep this civil, controlled, and get as much information as possible. So Essence has cards and pens, so everybody can write down their questions, and we'll be sure to ask as many of them as possible. Okay, I'm watching time. So we have specific questions for the legislature. So
During the 32nd legislature's August 2018 hearings, wherein the ARC-like agreement was ratified, several mandates were made by the legislature relative to the Department of Health and Department of Planning and Natural Resources, regulatory roles and responsibilities, with the stated intent of expanding those agencies' capacity in order to fulfill the mandates. Were those mandates funded and fulfilled? Can you provide an update on the current status of those mandates?
Let me say good evening to everyone and thank you for your question. As indicated, my name is Novel Francis and I'm the current Senate President of the 33rd Legislature of the Virgin Islands. So the short answer to your question is yes. Those regulatory agencies were in fact funded during the 2019-2020 budget and continue to be funded at the level that's required for the regulatory responsibility. Additionally, I want to say that when we conducted the vetting of the Limetree Bay and we considered it, what we had done was to, again, ensure that those cost analysis was done to make a determination what the needs of DPNR, Department of Labor, as well as Vitima and Department of Health, what those costs would have been, and we certainly funded. Ironically, the Committee of Government Operations, Consumer Protection, Energy, Environment, and Planning did conduct a site visit of Limetree on October 21st, and the committee members, along with other senators, were available to do that. I unfortunately had another event, which was a swearing in for some of the governor's cabinet members, so I wasn't able to attend that. However, they did a walkthrough of Limetree Bay, Limetree, the terminal, and the intended refinery reopening, and there was a subsequent committee hearing that's scheduled for tomorrow, right here at the University of Virgin Islands, at which time we intend to do the necessary probing and ask some of the very same question that is asked here this evening. My presence here this evening is really to, again, be able to glean from the public some of the concerns that may have been raised, and so that we can be prepared to ask those pointed questions when we meet with Limetree Bay. The Limetree Bay principals have already agreed to attend that hearing tomorrow, right here at 10 o'clock tomorrow. And so we're looking forward to that discussion in respect to some of those concerns that you may have. As well as the regulatory responsibility for the various agencies, we want to make sure that, again, based on the mandate that was given to them, that in fact they're in compliance with it. Some of it you discussed earlier in terms of the employment requirements and those issues. We intend to ask those probing and provocative questions as well, and hopefully have a response for the public at that time. I have with me this evening as well, if I may, I have the chair of the Finance Committee, Senator Kurt VLA, who could also reiterate the fact that we did in fact provide the funding to those agencies.
Thank you so much and good night, everyone. We made a request to the former commissioner of DPNR, the former commissioner of Department of Labor, to submit to the legislature a budget that would include adding professional capacity to both of those entities, adding engineers, environmentalists, etc., to DPNR, and adding a layer of employees at the Department of Labor that would be able to monitor to make sure that all those outlined in the contract is being adhered to and that they're paying the requisite unemployment tax, etc. We also requested from the DPNR commissioner, who was Don Henry at the time, that she provide to us a listing of necessary equipment that could do monitoring in all of the neighborhoods, especially on the western end of the island. We have been prepared to fund it. We funded all of the positions, and we are ready to fund the necessary equipment that would add the capacity to DPNR to also do their own monitoring and don't have to wait and get a report from Limetree or a report from the EPA. So the legislature is poised to make sure that all the tenets of the contract that we entered into with Limetree are basically followed. And we are just awaiting the lead. We're hoping that they have been able to add that professional capacity because we have funded those positions.
Just a quick follow-up. So Commissioner Oriole then has the requisite listing of equipment been submitted for funding to increase the government's capacity for monitoring?
Not at this time. We have received the funding for the additional employees. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to hire additional employees at this time. And the equipment capacity has actually been ordered for us to be able to do monitoring with respect to portable monitors. There's also something, if you are interested, on Thursday and on Friday here at the Great Hall, the EPA will also be hosting a meeting regarding the the plant-wide applicability limit permit for the facility. And in that process, there are also going to be permanent stationed air quality monitors that are proposed in there. There are 4 additional ones that go beyond the current limits of the Limetree facility. And so that's also another step to having additional monitoring take place outside of the facility within the community to understand the affected areas as well.
Thank you. We have one more question that we'd like to address to everyone, and then when the most current ArcLight agreement was passed, the territory had just experienced 2 Cat 5 hurricanes. Fortunately, the refinery was operating solely as a storage terminal at that time. Since then, we have had the opportunity to witness firsthand the impact that Hurricane Dorian had on Abaco and Grand Bahama in the Bahamian Islands when it ripped apart the Equinor oil storage facility on Grand Bahama. And for those of us that were here in '89, we remember what Hugo did at the existing refinery. It took days for people to get to the island to assess the breadth of the spill and weeks to begin containment and remediation. In total, at Abaco and Grand Bahama, 5 million gallons of oil were released, according to Gizmodo. In this age of more extreme weather events, what protections are in place at all our industrial complexes to protect our natural environment and human health impacts?
I guess I'll take the first stab at that. With any facility, again, I think that the key thing for that facility is the loss of any commodity. And your preparation is best, especially since when we have hurricanes, there is advanced warning for us to be able to begin to put in place whatever our preparedness plans are. And so the key thing at the facility would be that any areas where there are breaches that would be possible in the lines and such, they want to make sure that those lines are empty. And so if there is in fact capacity, or there will always be capacity in the tanks, then the response plan, and I believe Limetree could speak better to this, but this is just my sort of overview of what I've seen in place before, is that the idea is that you don't want any commodity inside your lines. You would put it to your empty tanks. Your tanks themselves are reinforced to be able to withstand a whole, well, short of some tornado picking up a boat and ramming it in there. Hopefully that never happens, but it should be able to withstand that based on the capacity and the level that the tanks are made out of. If the lines are, so the response protocol for those would be, in fact, to have the lines vacated, commodity in the tanks, and then they're under their maximum and secure. Just like any other facility in preparation for an oncoming storm, they put their response plans into effect. And so whether that's tankers having to leave the facility because they can't be on there, whether that's the facility making sure the lines themselves are clear and the commodity is under the maximum protection, all of those things come into play such that we minimize the risk as best as possible, understanding that natural disasters are in fact something that all we can do best is plan for them as well as possible. At the end of the day, if there is a situation like the Bahamas where 200 miles an hour just sits stagnant for 36 hours, I don't think we can expect that anybody would walk away from an event like that without being damaged. But if the question is, did the facility minimize the risk that actually took place by putting in place their protocols? And that's the best that I think that anybody under, in any kind of hurricane planning, that if you put your plan in place and you minimize that risk as best as possible, then you should be able to come out on the other end, without sustaining minimal damage. Unfortunately, there are incidents that happen, and you do have a release that, like they had, and the question is whether or not they were able to respond to that in particular, the specific damage. If they hadn't planned for it, then that might be why that release was elongated. But I think that from what we've seen in terms of the plans and preparations for the landfill, not the landfill, but for the facility, in terms of having all the containment valves, the shutoff valves, all of these things that are required, it truly does minimize that risk as best as possible.
The piece that I'll add is, the leadership aspect of it. I sat down with the senior individual for security, and we went through curfew passes, believe it or not. We actually went through pretty much name by name, line by line, who they wanted to have at their facility. And it was very good to see the leadership aspect of who was there from medical perspective to first responder response perspective. They did not want any key individuals being stuck outside their gate. They wanted all the key individuals in the facility to stay in the facility. So that was very good to see from a leadership perspective. And that's all I can say pretty much from Limetree's perspective. But I know they're very serious about protocols and setting up with the known hazards for the hurricanes. The challenges is obviously earthquakes and tsunamis with very little notice, how you respond to those also. So that's a concern down the road. But what happened in Bahamas, like Commissioner Oriol said, for that length of time with that force of wind, you try to mitigate. If you get a little bit, but you try to prevent the big event from happening.
Thank you. Several measures have recently been approved by DPNR and are soon to come before the legislature that relax CZM permitting requirements for activities at Limetree Bay. Can you elaborate on these measures and give the rationale behind reducing our local government's regulatory oversight, especially in a time when the nation is already facing a radically deregulated EPA? Can we please provide some insight into the permitting measures that will be put before the legislature during tomorrow's legislative session?
So I know of no mandate that CZM has approved that would relax any requirements. Again, over the last 2 years, or over the last 4, since ArcLight or Limetree became the owner of the refinery, there are 2 CZM permits that have been applied for. The first was the single point mooring, which would allow for the offshore transfer of the petroleum products. The second is something called the consolidated permit. And so the consolidated permit is the attempt by the department to place the Limetree facility in its entirety under one single permit for the department under CZM. The refinery itself predates CZM. CZM was enacted in 1978. The facility began its construction and operation in the 1960s. And so we had a number of permits that are called submerged lands permits that regulate the construction and then operation of the filled and submerged lands on the property. And then in the upland, all of those facilities, with the exception of the Coker unit, which was developed in 1993, all of those are pre-existing facilities. And so the consolidated permit took all of these permits that had expired, but yet we know the piers are there, the amount of the submerged lands is there, delineated what the filled lands were, and what we did is we consolidated everything that is currently existing. So there's no new work that is being approved under this. And we put all of that into one permit such that now, in the future, when there is a request by Limetree for development or for any new construction, that they would be able to modify this permit so it brings them into compliance with the CZM Act. Everything else on the facility, or the majority of the facility, predated and therefore was sort of in what we like to term grandfathered in. But there has been no relaxation of any requirements. There's been no development authorized under this, and so I'm not quite certain if there's specific information on that. I'd be more than happy to address it.
Senators, maybe you can address what's coming before you tomorrow?
First of all, I agree with Commissioner Oreo that I'm not aware of any legislation, again, to minimize the role and responsibility in terms of the EPA monitoring or the reduction of regulatory responsibility by DPNR. What I'm seeing here on the calendar is Bill 33-0105, an act amending Title 12, Chapter 21 of the Virgin Islands Coastal Zone Management by 1. Updating the chapter to reflect the current name of the department. 2. Increasing the term and per diem of members of the Coastal Zone Management Commission. 3. Modifying some of the standards for the issuance of coastal zone permits. 4. Modifying some of the requirements for the issuance of permits for the development of occupancy of trust land or other submerged or fill land. And 5. Decreasing the time period for filing an appeal with the Board of Land Use Appeals and decreasing the time period within which the Board of Use of Appeals must hold a specific hearing on the appeal. So those are the Bill 33-0105 is those are the terms that will be discussed tomorrow during the Committee of Government Operations, Consumer Affairs, Energy, Environment, and Planning.
If I hear correctly, the language in the bill is amending some, but there's no defining what that sum is. Will that happen in the hearing tomorrow, the definition of that?
Well, obviously there'll be some flushing out of the bill proposal, and it'll be heard at that time. Vote may or may not be taken. It could be held in committee. It could be moved on. Outside of that, there are several other process layers. It has to go to the Rules Committee and then finally to session. And so this bill could be significantly adjusted, modified, or amended before final passage.
Thank you. So we've gotten a lot of questions.
Can I just add in one thing in reference to the bill?
Please.
If there are any provisions within that bill that reduces the ability of DPNR to monitor or report, it definitely will be taken out. Okay, we have an opportunity to line item to get rid of stuff. I am not going to support any bill that reduces the ability of the government of the Virgin Islands to monitor what is going on at Limetree. So I'm going to read the bill again tonight, and I'm going to make sure that no language is included because I am a signatory on the bill. I'm going to make sure that no language is included in that bill that would reduce DPNR ability to be able to monitor what is going to take place at Limetree. And if it is, I definitely will be taking my name off, and I will be voting against this measure and encouraging my colleagues to make sure that we protect the environment of St. Croix and protect the ability for us to be able to monitor our environment. Thank you.
So I've done some speed reading. And we've got questions with specific concerns about our high schools. We've got quite a lot of questions about the monitoring, and we have some employment questions and environmental and disaster planning questions. So I kind of, I'm missing one. And more on emergency response. So I'm going to ask you to read the questions here. Let's see. And this is open to anybody on the panel.
Central High School is downwind. Hovensa had a number of events. The monitoring devices were not maintained and did not function as needed in time for warning and evacuation. Are these devices in place and maintained?
So, I would say that, and Angie, you can help me out. I do not believe that the monitoring devices external from the facility are in operation. Again, the department maintains portable devices, and it allows us to respond to a complaint or an incident. In 2015, the federal government, the EPA, amended the Clean Air Act. And in that amendment, it actually requires a whole lot more monitoring to take place by refineries and petroleum refineries. So now that the compliance date for that was January 2019. So any facility that is going to reopen, open or reopen, or in existence didn't shut down, has a specific responsibility to make sure that they're abiding by the new Clean Air Act. And so that's going to include additional monitoring that takes place within the facility itself, as well as along their fence line. And then there's also, as I expressed, the PAL permit requires these external monitoring devices to be placed out in the community. Part of the reason for the hearings that were going to be taking place on Thursday and Friday is that the department and the EPA is soliciting the input of the public on the locations as one of the things. And so please come out, voice your input as to the locations of where these are going to be maintained, and then with the support of the 33rd legislature, we would be able to identify additional locations for where monitors can be placed so that we can have adequate coverage to know whether or not the island or what sections of the island are being most impacted.
Thank you. So this next question says, there are releases at least once or twice a week at CTEC of a toxic substance that is affecting our high school students and teachers. There is no idea who to ask about these releases and what the substances are. So who can these people go to voice their complaint and figure out what these substances are that are affecting them?
So if in fact students, teachers, any facility is having it's feeling that they're having adverse effects, or they know that there's some sort of release, it is DPNR to report to, as well as the Department of Health. And reporting those symptoms also allow, again, when we get together, I believe it's ESF 5, if I'm not mistaken, Director Jackson. But when the Department of Health starts seeing these increase of symptoms within the community, now we get to the point where we would involve the incident command, and there's a specific response that the Department of Health engages in with the assistance of DPNR. They also get assistance or receive assistance from the CDC. And so if in fact there are symptoms being or release is identified, please contact both DPNR and the Department of Health for those.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Over here in St. Croix, the phone number for DPNR is 773-1082.
Thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in on that, Senator?
No, the 718.
718. 1311?
718, yeah, we no longer have 773 in that area, but it's 718-1311 for Department of Health.
Or 1310.
Right.
Thank you, Department of Health. Okay, so all of these are all around emissions and monitoring, and we will make sure that Commissioner Oriol, Vitima, and the senators have copies of these so that you have that for your hearing. So I'm going to try and pull them together. Somebody asked, why is Commissioner speaking for Limetree? We asked them to answer questions that we had written for Limetree since Limetree didn't come. How confident is DPNR in the refineries monitoring and reporting protocols? And how soon after the buoy release by the refinery did they inform DPNR? And a comment was for assistance to marine wildlife, 24 to 36 hour response timetable is too late. It's too long.
So I think the first question was, how confident are we in the response? I mean, in the reporting? Again, because the department is receiving, yes, we receive executive summaries of what those monthly reports are, but you also get the raw data from the machinery itself. And so those are things that can't, tamper with. That is relying on our experts, both here in the territory as well as the US EPA, to review that raw data and make sure that what is actually placed in the executive summary, we're able to verify that. There's a number of people abroad, especially, that are reviewing all facilities. And here we have an army of two, but they are two of the strongest, brightest people that I've ever met. And so I am very confident in their abilities. They've been monitoring this facility for almost 2 decades now. So with respect to their reporting of the line breach, I believe we received that from their consultant, who was actually working on there within 24 hours. So we received an email that the line had broken from the storms. They included pictures that they sent to us because, again, it's part of the consultant's plan that if anything deviates from what is permitted, they have to notify the department.
I'm going to try and group, okay? Bear with me if your specific question isn't answered. Does this method of monitoring and reporting ignore exposures to combinations of chemicals that may act in concert?
So, I mean, again, I am not an air quality engineer, so I don't think I can answer that one specifically. Again, I think that there are, that for the chemicals that we are in fact monitoring, the ones that we know have come from a result of having a refinery. But yes, Angie, come up here, please.
No, I don't want to come over here.
Yeah, but we're recording, so we'd really like your voice.
But
right?
well, take this for the mic.
I don't really
Go ahead. I don't really want to. Okay, so for Hovenza, like any other facility in the United States, remember we're part of the United States. The self-monitoring is very expensive for any government to run. They force facilities who are making profit to do these self-monitoring. What we have a handle on is that in the permit, we tell them the method. We tell them to calibrate. We tell them the type of equipment that is approved, which ones are not good equipment, which ones are. We ask them to, the monitors, most of them are monitoring every minute or every second. Then they average out an hour, they average out 8 hours, they average out 24 hours, and they keep averaging out monthly and then yearly. These, like he said, the data comes to us. If there's a spike, the data is uploaded into a system. The system it must have a connection with EPA and DPNR. So the air quality guys at the office could go into the computer and bring up the data. So all the pollutants, the ones that we're worried about, or the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, that's the 7 pollutants he's talking about. They're health-related standards, and they're in micrograms per cubic meter, which is very small. And they're done hourly, 8 hours, 24 hours. We also have standards on the toxic side. You have 188 hazardous pollutants. They also have to, like H2S is a big one for them. They have to give me that data. And they have to submit quarterly. If they have a release, and each of them have a threshold, the threshold isn't big, they must call the DPNR within 4 hours, whether they know it, where it's coming from in the 100 acres or whatever. They have to notify the department. I see a plume, I'm gonna respond in 24 hours. They have to segregate that area, tell me what the pollutant is. They may not have the quantity in the 24 hours, but after a while, they have to give another report in writing, the quantity, reportable quantities, the pollutant, the effects of the pollutant, how far the pollutant traveled. That's their responsibility. That's why they have a med station. So it's not just the 7, it's 188. And there's a annual reporting document that is given to EPA. I wish I had all the websites to give you because it's public information. You go on the website, you click, it gives you the toxic release numbers. It gives you all of those numbers. I just didn't think it was this intense. So I would have run.
What we will do is we will forward the websites to the Croix Foundation. And so that way they can put that on the
Right. So they used to send the books to us before. Everything is paperless, save trees. So now everything is on our website. Okay? Okay.
Thank you.
And your name, your full name is position, please? Angela Arnold. Angela Arnold, and you are, I'm part of the I'm the environmental engineer, and I'm part of the air pollution control program. Thank you. For DPNR.
So everybody knows who's speaking.
So our next question. Will there be additional measures taken to monitor groundwater and adjacent coastal waterways? How will we know our aquifer is not getting further compromised?
So, yeah. I mean, no, so from the coastal perspective side, again, the coastal water quality, the facility does have what we call a TIPDES permit. It's a territorial pollution elimination discharge system permit. And again, just as the air quality side is to report, the releases, the TIPDES permit machinery also reports the same releases, and the water pollution control program actively monitors the TIPDES permit. I do know that the groundwater was a large source of the previous consent decree on the property, for which there was a settlement. And so as part of the settlement, there is a section that is called the Environmental Response Trust that was formed, and that company is charged with the remediation of the groundwater and monitoring. And so this takes place on a daily basis. They submit the same monthlies to both DPNR and the US EPA. This is something that is not going to be an overnight sort of thing, an overnight cleanup. It's going to be something that is going to be in place for decades to come because remediation does in fact take a long time. If any of you are familiar with St. Thomas, we have the Tutu Wells Superfund site over there, and that has been being cleaned up since the 1980s. And, you know, it costs the department $500,000 a year to mitigate that site on an annual basis, and we're now in the 27th year of it. So this is something that was set up, though. There is a trust account. That account is what is going to pay for that cleanup and continues to monitor and clean up and remediate the impacted areas from the former Hovenza refinery sites.
A quick question. You referred to the consent decree. Is this a consent decree of 2012, or is this a preceding consent decree?
So this is I believe this is the consent decree of 2012.
And so that consent decree, everybody, it's going to be listed on the website. We have the whole document. So that consent decree, Limetree is complying with the terms and conditions of that consent decree that dictated some $700 million of mitigation to occur at the refinery.
So I think it's important to note that in the consent decree there are terms for operation, and then there's terms for the cleanup. And so Limetree did not assume the responsibility for the affected areas under the cleanup. And so those areas are in fact still the responsibility of Hovenza. And so Limetree is now in the discussions with modifying the consent decree for the operation, but the Environmental Response Trust continues to mitigate the affected areas.
We've been doing a little homework, right? So the EPA is in conversation with Limetree to modify the consent decree.
Yes, it's
Okay, because EPA will not respond to a Freedom of Information Act request by a number of people, just for the record, all right? So, folks, we hope there's a sign-up sheet in the back for anybody that wants to continue this type of conversation so that we can continue getting information. So if you sign up for that, it's not the sign-in sheet, but, you know, for ongoing conversations, because we're getting close to 7 o'clock. But there's, I'm just going to lump it together. There are some serious, no, you're going to do that last. Okay. There have been reports of unregistered sex offenders and unreported sexual assaults by Limetree staff and contractors. What is being done with community partners to address that issue? And and what's being done about the increase in sex trafficking that's happening on this island. So I'm just throwing them out there. And then the other employee type related question is, why are employees being asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement if they become ill? And how will Limetree, I'm just reading what somebody wrote, and how will Limetree protect the health of St. Croix against oil spills? But that first question was important. So, anyone who'd like to respond? Maybe Senator Francis, you can. You know what? You know we go way back, so right.
Well, I've been out of the law enforcement business for quite some time. First of all, it's been almost 7 years, if not more. But I think that it's a fair question, and it's something that I could certainly pose to the police commissioner and the police department so that we could get an adequate response on it. You know, the sexual offenders is something that is also federally monitored, and we know from time to time that both the federal government as well as the local Department of Justice execute warrants and pick up all those individuals that may be in violation. So they're not just required to report here locally, but there's a sexual offenders registry that tracks their whereabouts And there's even a GIS system that really track the location of these individuals as well. So I believe that beyond the allegation, I'd like to hear from the police commissioner in terms of the specifics and what's being done to address that. But it is a fair question, something that we need to look into.
Anybody else want to tackle that one?
So what punitive measures can be taken to assure enforcement if Limetree does not follow mandates and are not in compliance?
So the department and all the permits that we issue, there are regulatory remedies that are associated with each program, and so I believe, like I know in the original CD there are infractions for exceedances. I know that our local territorial air pollution control laws, they also have a dollar per day value. And Angie, I'm gonna ask you to help me out. Is it 50,000 per day?
It's $50,000 per day per violation.
Per
by
violation.
PI code, and then each consent decree for each equipment, like say for instance a flare, it has a specific stipulation based on the type of exceedance. And so they're going starting from $10,000 per day per violation.
Yeah.
Like I said, the VI one is $50,000 per day per violation, and for the VI, we don't care what it is. But for the consent decree,
It's specific.
it's very specific. It's line item, per
So-
heater, per compressor, whatever.
Yeah. So we do have punitive damages that the territory can seek when we have violations and offenses.
Thank you. And for the senators, can the agreement be amended to include internal monitoring by public authorities to prevent man-made disasters?
In respect to the amendment of well, first of all, the legislature could only ratify agreements. Any negotiation is done by the executive branch. Also, that question will have to be posed to the executive branch in respect to the agreement in that vein. But I would imagine that there is always an opportunity to amend, as long as that there is a mutual agreement between these individuals, because the agreement is really to protect the community or the government of the Virgin Islands as well as the entity that's involved in the agreement. So there is an opportunity for it to be amended at that level.
Thank you. And, some people did provide us with statements and questions. There's definitely a need for a health one. Someone asked about the cancer registry, when it's going to be initiated here on St. Croix. My understanding is it was supposed to have started in 2016, and it has zero. Okay.
That's not true. I'm
The
a cancer survivor myself.
The cancer
but
registry?
the cancer registry is in fact up and running at the Department of Health. They have it has been slow in terms of populating it, but I visited the site several years ago, might have been prior to the storm, and in fact there is a cancer registry. Miss Catherine Arnold was the one that was responsible for putting the cancer registry in place.
So, as part of the settlement with the government of the Virgin Islands, Hovenza placed, I believe it's $4.8 million into a trust, and the department is working with the Department of Health to secure a contract with Mount Sinai for it's a pediatric registry. I can't remember what the specifics are off the top of my head. That contract made its way last year up to the Department of Justice, but there were some things that we could not get both the Department of Justice and the contractors, Mount Sinai, to agree on, and we're still negotiating those things. But it is still the goal of the government, in fact, to have the pediatric registry up and going. We are actively working on it, but it's going to be some negotiating that takes place with Mount Sinai in order to get this completed.
Thank you. So we've raised a lot of questions and gotten some answers. We want to thank you, gentlemen, for coming. We really appreciate your taking your time. I want to thank my co-moderator. Your name just...
Lynette Groovy.
Yay! Yay, UBI. We've got a lot of questions, so before we close out, I'll ask Deanna to make some closing statements. But what we'd like you all to know is that engagevi.org is online. We're creating a repository of information and data because a wonderful researcher out of Hawaii handed me a 2012 health survey that had been done by the University of the Virgin Islands that gave us some amazing statistical data about the impacts on neighborhoods surrounding the industrial complex. It's and there's more data as we find more historical data. It's being loaded to that site. And we also want to encourage people to understand that the only reason that this gathering happened is because if you got to have a conversation, you can take it outside. Thank you. We're almost done. Is because a lot of people have been doing a lot of work and a lot of people have begun to organize around different issues. And the key for us is that this is a beginning of a series of conversations. The Department of Health needs to come and talk to us and explain to us what's happening. And more importantly, then we need to decide what we as a community are going to do and how we are going to activate. Just look up bucket brigades. Deanna.
This is very quick. Just want to say thank you so much for coming out. We didn't know if we'd get 2 people or 20 people, so the fact that we have over 100, I really appreciate people coming out tonight. This is a big deal for us. We are a small organization, and one of the things that we debated with our nonprofits is we live in a community that oftentimes can be punitive when people try to engage and people try to seek information. And so it was a lot for us as a small organization to decide to do this, but we thought it was really important because so many questions have come to us, and we have all this data. There's another really interesting study that was done on the Virgin Islands by a professor in Vermont at Bennington College. It's a phenomenal report about our story and the backstory of heavy industry on St. Croix, and it's loaded up on the website. So as information comes to us, we'll be loading it up. We'll try to just frame some of these questions and put them on the website also. And really and truly, this is the beginning of the conversation. We hope that in the future we have 3 other sectors that I think have a story to tell and have want an opportunity to engage our stakeholders. And so hopefully we'll be able to do that with our health and human services sector. But really and truly, the next step is yours. And I just want to say thank you for taking the first step to come out here tonight. And to our guests, thank you. No, you all did not RSVP, but thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate you coming and answering questions. Daryl, JP, thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it.